So what we have planned today is a chance to hear from an industry expert, a policy expert, and a legislative leader on this issue of e-waste and metal recycling in Minnesota and opportunities to improve our rate of e-waste and metal recycling, as well as policies we should consider to make that change possible. My name is Aaron Klemz. I'm the Chief Strategy Officer at Minnesota Center for Environmental Advocacy, and I'm really pleased to host this conversation today. And we've got three actual St. Paul experts in the room today. We've got Maria Jensen from Repowered, which is a St. Paul electronic waste recycling firm. She's the environmental and safety officer there. And Maria's been working on ways to enhance Minnesota's e-waste recycling laws and is really an expert on how our current e-waste recycling system works and how it can work better. So welcome, Maria. Secondly, we've got Dr. Roopali Phadke. She is a professor of environmental studies at Macalester College in St. Paul. And her teaching and research focuses on energy and climate policy, citizen science, community-based research methodologies, and sustainable development initiatives. And she's currently the principal investigator on a multi-year National Science Foundation study on mining futures. So she's really looked into this question of mining and metal acquisition and how it relates to the clean energy transition here in Minnesota and globally. So welcome, Dr. Phadke. And lastly, Representative Athena Hollins represents St. Paul in the Minnesota House of Representatives, Representative 66B. She was recently elected majority whip for the DFL caucus, and she's going into her second term, and she was in her first term, she was a key legislator on clean energy and environmental funding issues, and has been really digging into ways to improve Minnesota's laws on metal recycling. So welcome to all three of our panelists. And I'm going to start, we're going to go kind of in turn. We're going to have a section of this conversation for each of our panelists, and then we'll have a chance for kind of more broad-ranging cross-pollination after we get through that section as well. We're going to start with Maria Jensen, who works for Repowered as their environmental and safety officer. And I'm wondering if you're going to start by telling people a little bit about Repowered's business and what you do there.
Of course, yeah. So as Aaron mentioned, I work at an e-waste recycling facility. We are unusual because we are a nonprofit, and most e-waste recycling companies are not. We have processed 40 million pounds of e-waste since 2011 when we started. We are also a work readiness organization. We have around 30 members in our work readiness program every year. And they're mostly people that are coming out of incarceration and, coming through our program. Yeah.
So, I mean, it's not easy being an e-waste recycler, and especially a nonprofit. So you're kind of an interesting organization. We're literally swimming in electronic waste, in electronic devices in the United States. So I'm wondering what challenges you face and what you want our audience to know about the challenges your business and industry faces here in Minnesota.
Yeah, so e-waste is the fastest growing waste stream in the world, and I would argue the fastest changing as well. I have weekly conversations with our staff. It's just like, what do I do with this? Right? There's new electronics being created every day, and more they're being kind of encased in plastic, right? It's getting harder to recycle them. Lithium batteries are now just in everything, which are a huge fire risk. So one of my favorite examples is AirPods. Headphones, they're basically 3 lithium batteries encased in plastic. So it's kind of just good luck recycling those without causing a fire, right? That's definitely one of the biggest challenges for us, is just the changing waste stream.
Well, I mean, and it's interesting too, because as we've been digging into this question of Minnesota's e-waste laws, like our e-waste law was written in 2007, and it defines like covered electronic devices pretty narrowly. I'm wondering if you talk a little bit about like how that's shrinking over time, because we've got a 2007 definition of electronics, and we have all these changing.
Yeah. Unfortunately, when they wrote that legislation, they did specify specific types of electronics like CRT TVs, right? The big tube TVs, and fax machines were another one, right? So as our e-waste stream matures and changes, that we're seeing those items less and less in the stream, but that doesn't mean the stream is shrinking. The stream is actually growing, but those items are becoming less prevalent. So as they shrink, so do the dollars that go into that program. Back, I want to say in 2015 or so, it was supporting 35 million pounds of e-waste recycling in Minnesota every year. And now it's only supporting 23 million. Just every year, it's just getting smaller and smaller. So that's definitely legislatively, that's the biggest challenge to e-waste recycling in Minnesota. And we see that kind of manifest itself in the fact that we only recycle, or we only collect 23.7% of our e-waste in Minnesota. We only collect that much for recycling. So
if only 1 in 4 pounds of electronic waste is entering the recycling stream, where's the rest of it going?
unfortunately, though, some of it is in people's basements. A lot of it ends up in landfills and incinerators. And this is a huge public health and environmental justice issue because e-waste contains toxic materials like mercury, cadmium, lead, PCBs, corrosive chemicals, etc. And when that material ends up in an incinerator, it contaminates our air. And when it ends up in a landfill, it has the chance of leaking into the groundwater. And as we know, most polluters, including landfills and incinerators, are disproportionately located near marginalized communities.
So we've got this problem of a shrinking amount of covered electronic devices. We're at about 1 in 4. You said 23.7% of that enters the recycling stream. How does that compare with other places in the United States, for example? And how does it compare to how other states have attacked this problem?
Right. So California has a very different method. They have an advanced recovery fee instead of what we have in Minnesota, which is called an ERP, EPR, and producer responsibility bill. In California, they basically just have a flat tax on certain types of electronics, and that money goes into the recycling stream. So that way it doesn't decrease over time. So other states, there's 25 states that have management legislation for e-waste. And right now, California is definitely doing the best on their collection side.
So when you say like extended producer responsibility, I think people are there's actually a lot of these types of legal regimes in Minnesota, right? We have a number of products that have some sort of extended producer responsibility. And I'm wondering if you could walk people just through a little bit about how that system works. Like if it's not working the way it's intended right now, where is it breaking down, and where do you see problems in that current set of laws and rules that we have?
Primarily, I would say the biggest problem is in the definition of what e-waste they cover, like we talked about earlier. But so with the EPR, the manufacturers they tell the state, right, how much they're manufacturing every year in Minnesota, and then from there they pay a tax to cover how much recycling of those specific covered electronics devices is happening in the state. They have like a certain amount of credits that they need to put into the system, and then the manufacturers themselves, along with a third party, choose which recyclers they go to. And unfortunately, right now in Minnesota, a lot of the credits are leaving the state. So I would say that's another issue too. It's just that the manufacturers are choosing where the credits go, and so sometimes it's not supporting the local e-waste economy.
Okay. I know we're going to come back to this question of policy when we talk to Dr. Phadke and also Representative Hollins. But I'm wondering, like, so you said the covered electronic devices, that's the biggest thing. Is there anything else you'd want, like, if you were to pick out another thing to point to? Is it just the way that this structure is built, or what's the one thing you'd really want to change besides just the covered electronic devices and what's covered under the regime?
Having enough money in the system to cover all electronics, right? At Repowered, we define electronics as anything with a battery, a cord, or circuit board. So a recycler should be able to just tell you, like, go to the state, right, and say, hey, we recycled this many electronics or this weight in electronics, but instead we're picking just like a few items out of the whole list of things that we've been recycling and saying, okay, we have this weight to report. And it's very arbitrary in some ways, who gets the credits, who doesn't get the credits.
Makes a lot of sense. I mean, I think that definition of covered of electronics makes a lot of sense, right? It's got a cord, it's got a circuit board, it's got a plug, it's an electronic device. And that makes a lot of sense to try to make it a little bit simpler, or just for folks to understand what's covered and what's not. I mean, one last thing before I go on and talk a little bit with Dr. Phadke. You've mentioned that there's this big stockpile of stuff in people's basements and closets and stuff like that. What do we know from research about how much e-waste is just sitting in people's households right now? Sorry, Maria, are you on mute? Oh, that was a question for you. I'm sorry.
Oh, I
thought
you were talking to Dr. Roopali.
No, that was my fault. Actually,
yeah,
if anyone has thoughts about that, that'd be great.
There are millions of pounds. Actually, that study is from Wisconsin, but we can assume that it's pretty similar to Minnesota. There are millions of pounds of electronics in people's basements right now. So as we need to keep that in mind as we go forward with new legislation. What's going to happen? Like if we are able to provide free drop-off for people, what's going to happen in the first few years, right? Are we going to be flooded with e-waste? Because that is one of the primary barriers for consumers to recycle. Is it's not free right now. The drop-off is not free and it's not conveniently located. So if we fix those problems in with new e-waste legislation, we might be flooded in the first few years with electronics coming out of people's basements. Yeah.
Great. Next time. That was really helpful. Thank you. So I wanted to turn to Dr. Phadke. And first of all, thank you for being here. We really appreciate you joining us, and your kind of international and academic perspective on this is really valuable. You've studied the challenges of acquiring metals in a global context, as well as here in Minnesota. And one thing that's really clear is that the US lags behind many other countries in our recycling and reuse policies. And I'm just wondering if, like, you have thought from your perspective that there are some things we should be learning in the international context from other places in the world that are doing a better job of tapping that e-waste stream to use it to get metal.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks everyone for joining us today. I wish I could see those hundreds of faces. To ping off of Maria's comment, I mean, there are drawers of shame in basements all over the world. It just seems that ours in the US are deeper and need to be excavated faster. There's so much to learn from the rest of the world. I think that in particular, recycling and recovery are part of a circular economy mandate in many countries, and that has not quite caught up with us here in the United States. And those circular economy mandates can be economy-wide, right? Not just to very specific sectors. So we know this to be the case in Japan as well. So Maria just gave us some statistics from Minnesota and from the US. Here's one to compare with. Switzerland is considered to be one of the most effective in the world at recycling. They have a recycling collection rate for e-waste at 75% and a 95% rate for digital e-waste, so smartphones, computers, and so on. So we have far, far to go. Of course, there's lots of reasons why the Swiss can do things we cannot. We can talk about that, but it's useful to know that there are these examples out there in the world. Also, we see in the EU lots of training and research programs built around the circular economy. There are EU investment credits for companies and for universities and researchers to really think about this. And in particular, my interest in looking at the European Union in particular as a model is their investment in thinking about urban mining. And I'll say, maybe a little bit more about that in a minute. The other thing I want to bring up is information. And I think that's often what we are lacking. Information is really key to building a circular economy, particularly one for metals. And in my research and in my conversations with scholars and industry practitioners around the world, but particularly in Europe, I've been so impressed at how information networks can be built to address these issues. So for example, the Netherlands has invested so much in building what we could think of as a harvest network or harvest dashboard to help connect those who are looking for raw materials with those who have them, as part of their own deconstruction or shift to new practices. And so being able to connect the information, not just on who, but how many tons, when is it available, how can it be accessed, right? Those are really important. And that is a thing we can do at a regional scale, right? And so building that kind of infrastructure, that sort of neural network for the recovery of materials, I think is something that we lag on. And then the other thing that I might mention, and it's not an uncontroversial issue, is that e-waste is connected to waste, right? Just notions of waste in general. Throughout the European Union, there are bans on landfills in many countries. And that means that there isn't the same, away place that there is in many parts of the US for things that don't get recycled or people that don't have opportunities to recycle. And so that can prompt innovation. I want to say, though, that, in many European countries, the landfill ban has led to an increased use of an incineration. And that incineration is different, I think, in many ways technologically than what we conventionally do in the US, but it is still incineration, and it does have byproducts, and it does have emissions. But I think we ought to think about our relationship to recycling in terms of our relationship to all kinds of waste and our spatial sense of where waste goes. And when we can continue to open landfills upon landfills, that is a disincentive to recycling and to recovery.
Yeah,
maybe I'll stop there.
And it's really important to keep foregrounding this question of environmental justice in this conversation, I think, and it's appropriate to think about what the alternatives to landfilling might be. But also there's another set of alternatives as well, which is where else we would get metals from if we don't get them from recycling and recovery operations. And environmental justice is also a huge topic when it comes to mining. And a lot of the mining proposals that we look at impact environmental justice implications, have environmental justice implications for downstream communities and downwind communities. And I know that you've worked on a global context to look at this question as well. There's been a number of studies that have looked at the connection between, for example, indigenous lands and mining operations. And what should we be thinking about in terms of environmental justice in the global scale on the mining issue as well, besides just the issues that relates to metals recovery?
Yeah, thank you for this question. This question is actually reminding me that when I started off my career, even as an undergraduate, I was really interested in mining. And at that point, I was studying the uranium mining on the Navajo reservations around the country and around the world to feed the nuclear industry. Right? And so this is a question and a story that is decades and decades, centuries really in the making. One thing I really try to emphasize about environmental justice is that we know that a decarbonized global economy will be vastly more metals intensive than the fossil fuel economy that we're replacing. And I think we need to come to terms with that, right? So we are going to have more metals in circulation to provide the climate change solutions that we want. And that is an important transition that has a lot of environmental justice implications. And so what does that mean? We define environmental justice based on the disproportionate burdens that some communities face. And those are disproportionate both in terms of power and their material impacts, right? But these can be double burdens, that there are communities that are impacted by mining. Those are also often the communities that are then asked to fight for alternatives. And so it's the legacy burden on top of the burden of imagining something different in the future. This is all of our work, right? It's not the work of just those communities that are impacted. Mining also adds to the cumulative burdens of the fossil fuel economy. So new mining, mining that might be permitted in the future, is likely going to impact those same regions that are already experiencing other kinds of exposures. And some of those exposures are coming from the fossil fuel economy. This is probably not nothing new for us to think about, but it's important that we think about how we're building a future carbon-free economy, not on the assumptions of the fossil fuel economy, right? And one major assumption of which is that the fossil fuel economy required sacrifice zones and sacrifice people, that's built into the model. And we can't approach it in the same sort of way as we move into this next century around, particularly searching for climate solutions. So let me just offer one more thing to think about. And it's something I've been thinking a lot about in the context of Minnesota, is this, let me call it the displacement fallacy, right? That if we bring mining, repatriate mining to the United States, bring more mining into being here in Minnesota, that it means less mining somewhere else, and particularly in the global South. The same companies that are speculating for metals in Minnesota are doing so throughout the world. This has been recorded over and over again by the World Bank. So it's not more mining here means less mining there. We're actually looking at a future where we're increasing mining exponentially everywhere to try to get a hold of particularly the critical minerals we need for the new economy. So this is something we really have to think about, because I think it's really easy to assume saying yes here means that Rio Tinto, for example, might be saying no somewhere else, when in fact we see this through the networks of frontline communities globally that are connecting with one another to really try to understand this new expanded face of mining around the world.
That's really well said. Thank you. I mean, I'm also just conscious of the fact that, like, we've already talked about this idea of a way in several different contexts, right? The idea that, people are unaware, for example, of what happens with waste after it leaves their household. That's one of those examples of a way. And also this idea of where materials come from for the products that you purchase and what you use is also another example of not really fully understanding, how people that are distant to us are impacted by the decisions that we make. And that's really useful to kind of to foreground that, I think. Besides policy change, what are some of the cultural and societal norms we have about, whether it's about waste or mining or materials, that are holding back our ability to maximize reuse and recycling of materials and metals? I'm wondering what your research and your experience tells you about what we can do to change that here.
Yeah, I simply think we need to change our framework and our mindset around recycling. And I was really excited to see Maria's organization rebrand themselves from Dept to Repowered. I mean, I think that's part of this shift. Recycling is often associated with dirty, dead-end jobs. It's like that task, that chore is like the last thing you want to do is take the recycling out, right? You take the trash out and you take the recycling out. It's like the least favorable kid in the family gets that job. Honestly, I work with young people all the time, and I hardly hear anybody tell me they want to grow up and work in the recycling industry, right? So we need to change what this means to society and to young people in particular. I think thinking about it in terms of reverse logistics and the circular economy does make it feel forward-looking and really a business enterprise. Refurbishment, remanufacturing, the global market for reverse logistics, it's like I've heard statistics like a $600 billion industry. And so there's so much opportunity there. I think we need to help people understand that. And it is really like the leading edge of business enterprise, right? Helping companies no longer think about fresh inputs or trucking things to landfills, to help industries find ways to collect and process and reuse existing materials rather than virgin materials. This is where it's at, and we want to encourage people to be thinking about that as not a waste industry in particular, but just really about like the central job of an efficient economy. I think I would add to that I think we need to change our geographical mindset about where things come from, right? Especially things that we consider quote unquote natural resources. We think of natural resources as coming from hinterlands, like the forests and mines that are far away from the urban centers. This is how this country, right, grew up. And so I think this is this great opportunity to flip that. And so I've been doing a lot of research on the theme of urban mining because I think it's really interesting to think about. This is where companies like Repowered really come in. So the idea of urban mining is that mining is not just the jurisdiction of those rural places, right? That in fact, I think we started talking about the basements that are full of the drawers of the things. Those are actually micro mines, right? Those are places that can be harvested. And so that work is all of our work. And if we think about policy that enables us to recoup some of the economic investments that we've made in those things, then we benefit. It's a new way to frame the work of mining. And I think it helps to address that like political polarization that we have, that cities consume things that we get from rural places, and then we export the harms of that kind of manufacturing to those places. So I guess I would argue for a cultural shift in the way we think about what recycling is, but also a geographical shift in the way we think about where things come from.
That's really well said. And I love the idea of, that junk drawer being a micro mine. It's an interesting way to shift people's perspective on it. And I appreciate that very much. Representative Hollins, we'd love to talk to you about a little bit about this as well. And I'm just intrigued by starting out by the question, but what can you tell our audience about why you are engaged on this issue and what it means to you and your constituents? Oh, sorry, you need to take yourself off mute.
Sorry, I thought I did. Okay.
Nope.
No, thank you for the question and thank you for having me. I am very intimidated by this panel. I don't think I necessarily belong here, but I'm thrilled to be talking about this issue. So for me, I'll back up a little bit. When I came into the legislature in 2020, I had a lot of passion and not a lot of knowledge on the policy of what to do around climate change and environmental issues and climate justice. So I kind of went in full force, talking about a lot of these climate issues and what I wanted to get done and how we needed to move to renewable energy. And of course, the pushback that I got in the legislature was, if we move to renewable energy, we have to keep mining. We absolutely have to keep doing this work. We have to bring metals into this system that we have, because otherwise we can't do it. And while that struck me as ultimately true, right, that we do absolutely need to have metals included in this system, what I started thinking about was how much we have out that's already included in the system and what we can do to, instead of extracting something new, continue using what we have within our system already. So I had a bill on zero waste that included electronic recycling as a part of that zero waste bill. And I thought, hey, this is great. The people who keep yelling at me about how we need to have metals will be really enthusiastic about this bill because it includes electronics recycling. And so when I presented it, the very people who had yelled at me about how I needed to consider mining were like, no, we hate this. We're not going to do it. And so I was, surprised and disheartened, but also it inspired me to start working on specific legislation for this issue because it's so important and so necessary. And I really think it's an opportunity for us to move away from our current way of thinking and move, hopefully, Minnesota towards a more economic independent future, as well as, a resource independent future. So that's really where I'm coming at it from.
That makes a lot of sense. And it's interesting to think about how the allies of one thing can end up kind of shifting a little bit when you present it in a different light. See it all the time at the legislature. I guess one thing I want to back up a little bit on is I know that climate is a real focus of the incoming majority in the Senate and also the existing House majority for the DFL. And with the control of the Senate and shifting and now having aligned with the governor and the House, I think we can expect to see a lot of action on clean energy and electric vehicles. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about what you're expecting to see this session in that area.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I think we have a lot of things that we're aligned on. I don't think we're 100% aligned on everything. Certainly the 100% clean energy goal for 2040, I think is going to be a top priority for the House and the Senate. I also think that we're going to finally be able to push things like electric school buses forward, as well as more infrastructure for electric vehicles. One of my pet projects is making those available, making charging available on the streets in new apartment buildings that are being built or new high density housing that's being built. And also looking at mass transit, rail. I mean, these are things that we absolutely have to focus on, because the reality is most of my district can't afford an electric car, right? Like, these single person solutions are not the things that are going to move us forward. We have to look at things that change the system in which we're living and will provide for a larger group of people. Because I think most of us, at least in the House, I guess I can't speak for the Senate, but at least in the House, we recognize that, individual changes are great, but they're very slow in coming. And honestly, we need to move a lot faster than that.
Yeah. And at the national level, there's been a lot of movement. I mean, like the passage of the Inflation Reduction Act has been really transformative. I mean, we're still figuring out in our office, like, how this is going to impact all this work. But we've also seen attempts to link climate action with rollbacks on environmental laws in the name of the metal availability for the clean energy and electric vehicle transitions. For example, though, they call it the Manchin side deal that was associated with the Inflation Reduction Act, which has not become law. And I'm just wondering if we could expect similar attempts in Minnesota's legislature as it pursues climate legislation like the 100% clean energy bill.
Potentially, I think that is possible. There are a couple of things that we're keeping our eye on with regards to how we move forward. I think there's a lot of conversation, and I might be going out of place right here, but conversations on ethanol and biofuel that we need to keep an eye on as far as climate change and where we want to actually see ourselves going in the next 20 to 50 years. But I think in general, we're pretty well aligned on where we think we need to move. I do anticipate that there will be some folks who this is a pain point for. And for that reason, especially as whip, I recognize that talking about mining is a different conversation than talking about electronic recycling, right? And e-recycling and e-waste. Because, I think that there are some steep, there are some definite cultural shifts that absolutely need to happen, especially for different parts of the state, where folks see mining as their only recourse and their only way of economic freedom. And so I'm very sensitive to that, having grown up in a rural area. Like, I understand how it feels to have people from the capital city or from major metropolitan areas telling you that your way of life is wrong and that you need to change everything that you're doing. So recognizing that is what's happening, but also we need to recognize that what we're doing now is not sustainable, and we absolutely have to move forward in our policy and our way of thinking. And so part of that work, I think, maybe I'm jumping ahead, but part of that work on the policy side is figuring out what economic development is available for those communities and making sure that we are making this just transition and making it as fair as possible, because their struggles, like on the Iron Range, are very real, right? I mean, it's no joke. It's not something that we're just making up out of nowhere. There's real concern about how people are going to feed their families and how they're going to fund their schools and things like that. And so I think that it's incumbent upon us as legislators to really be thinking about all the members of Minnesota and really be investing deeply in those areas where folks feel like they have no other answers, and try to help them provide answers and work in conjunction with them to figure out how to move things forward that will be good for that community as well as good for Minnesota and the country at large.
Yeah,
go ahead.
That's really well said. I was wondering, I had one particular question about a bill that's come up in the legislature before. I think you might be familiar with it, right to repair, because it's one of those bills that I think culturally is so interesting. I mean, the push for it largely has come from agricultural communities that want to fix things like their combine, but they're not able to do that. And then of course there's the flip side with electronic devices where we have broken screens where you can only go to the manufacturer to get them fixed. I'm wondering what the prospects are for right to repair legislation in the upcoming legislation, because it's had some really interesting bipartisan support across the last couple sessions.
Yeah, I love right to repair. So right now I'm in Hawaii visiting my family, and they have a macadamia nut farm. So this is personally important to me also because we absolutely have to be able to repair our tractors and our equipment in order to harvest. And if you think it's hard repairing tractors in Minnesota, you have no idea what it's like in Hawaii, right? Like waiting for the John Deere guy to get over here is not fun. So I actually am pretty hopeful about the right to repair legislation. I think that it stands a really good chance of passing, just because there is that sort of collective understanding of a sense of fairness in what we're doing. And especially, I would love to move the way we think about this from just these, large ticket items, like we're talking about, like a combine, but also to smaller items that are easily repaired. Our culture right now is too ready to throw things away the second that they break, right? Or to simply have it replaced, which, is not really, they kind of make it seem like, oh, isn't it great? You're just trading it in. And it's like, well, is that what's happening? We have options other than that. And so, I think what's nice about right to repair is that it brings both like rural and greater Minnesota folks, as well as Twin Cities folks together to say, like, inherently, we know this is a bad practice. And we've just let corporations go too far in what they're able to do and how they can control products that we literally took our time and money to purchase.
Yeah, I mean, it's really interesting to think about how much has shifted in just the last generation or two on this question. I mean, my brother a couple of years back bought a house that was built in the 1950s, and it had the same appliances as when it was new in 1958. And they were still operating, 60 years later. And I think about how crazy that is in the world where we're getting a new computer every 2 years or a new phone every 2 years, and how much culturally that's shifted in just a couple of generations here in the United States.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that is totally correct. I think about how, our washer stopped working at some point and it's ancient, and the guy came in to repair it and he was like, never get rid of this. Like, you will never get a washer this good again. Just keep fixing it. Do not get a new one.
That's good. That's good advice. One last thing I'll ask before I kind of turn it back towards some questions from the audience for you, Representative Hollins, is that you've heard from Maria and Dr. Phadke about some of the challenges Minnesota faces and some of the information about the global perspective on e-waste and metal recycling. What have you taken away from their perspective in this conversation so far about things that need to be changed or what the priority needs to be at the legislature?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I'd love to respond to just some of the concerns too about where are we going to get our metals. In February of this year, I was approached by two individuals from IRPS as a nonprofit in the Iron Range, and they had the beginnings of a study on e-waste content. And then since then, we've been working together to complete this study on 62 different elements that are present in the e-waste stream just here in Minnesota, just to kind of quantify the weight that might be possible to extract. And to give you an idea of kind of the order of magnitude of what we found, if we were able to extract all of the copper each year from our e-waste stream, we would have enough to manufacture 155,000 EVs every year just in Minnesota, enough silver for over 400,000 solar panels, and enough palladium for over 1 million cell phones. So, and that's yearly, and it's just based on the Minnesota e-waste with kind of the population that we have now. So there's definitely a lot of opportunities there, and comparing it kind of to the mines that are being proposed in northern Minnesota, a lot of the metals that the projections of what we would get from the metals in e-waste are on par with those mines that are being proposed. So, and we kind of did, yeah.
Yeah,
we did some kind of rough work on jobs too. And if we had some legislation that was able to promote closer to 100% recycling rate of our electronics, we might hope to see around 3,000 extra jobs being added to our economy, just in the collection, sorting, and the shredding processes of e-waste, which are kind of the first two main steps of processing, which doesn't include the material recovery process.
And then, of course, there's additional jobs that are created as a result of manufacturing goods with those materials once they've been recovered, which isn't even incorporated in that, right?
Right.
Wow. I mean, 3,000 jobs is a lot. I mean, I think if I recall correctly, the current employment in all of the mines in northern Minnesota is about 4,000 folks. And so those are comparable numbers and really impressive work. I wonder if I can turn back to Representative Hollins for just a second. Like, that's pretty big stuff. I mean, like, what do you take away from these conversations about what to do with the legislature about it? I mean, interested in your perspective.
Well, so first of all, I'm super tickled by the idea of urban mining. I made a note in my phone to follow up with you on that because I want to learn more. But I know in general, Maria and I have had conversations about where we want to see policy move and sort of in what vein. And there were a couple of different aspects that we thought would be particularly important. Right, like improving collections and drop off and making drop off free for electronic recycling, like making it easier for people to, provide their electronics for recycling. And then in addition to that, having better legislation or policy on burning and landfilling of electronics. So kind of coming at it from different angles, making it easier for folks to recycle it and making it harder for those materials to be simply incinerated. And then we also talked about, making sure we're properly funding those recycling facilities. As we know, as the increase of e-waste, continues and electronic recycling increases, we want to make sure that all of those recycling facilities are properly funded. And in the same vein, I don't remember who was talking about it, but how do we shift culture to make sure that young people are thinking about this as a part of how to get involved in climate change and climate justice, because we need those people to start moving in that direction and to doing recycling work, because that's so crucial. And we're going to need those folks. And part of that is going to have to be paying a living wage, like making it appealing to be doing that work and making sure that we pay folks, understanding that a lot of times it is difficult work and it is backbreaking work. But if we want it to be a really just transition to this, we have to make sure that we are paying folks comparably to what places like the mines will pay them, right? Like there's no way we can move people over. We have to make sure that they see this as an economic opportunity for themselves and for their families and for their communities. And if they don't, we're just going to keep sticking with the same thing. So I do think there's a ton of opportunities in a lot of different ways that we can come at this issue legislatively. And, Maria and I kind of were talking about, is it all together? Are we breaking it apart? Are we going to, attack it from different angles and just wait to see what lands? And, that was before we knew we had the trifecta. So now I'm more hopeful at just trying to do everything all at once. And push it forward, because I think this is something that we can get a lot of, if not bipartisan support, at least support from both greater Minnesota and the metro area.
Yeah, I think everything all at once might be the theme of this legislative session for you all.
Can I just respond really quick too?
Yeah.
I think Representative Hollins, you may have mentioned at one point about thinking about mining as a different conversation than thinking about e-waste. And I think we've actually come around to saying a little bit more about that just now. I mean, I would love to think that it is actually one conversation. And for example, when we talk about permitting new mines, we require that those facilities and counties are investing in the circular economy of metals at the same time, because this is all clean energy policy at the end of the day. And it would be incredible to imagine a kind of omnibus policy that includes not just clean energy goals, but goals around e-waste, around right to repair, and incentivizing circular economy. I mean, that would be such a gold standard for Minnesota to be able to offer the rest of the country. And just a little side note on that, I mean, the Inflation Reduction Act was essentially an industrial policy. It was not a regulatory policy. It does not have a lot of regulatory frameworks. That's been some of the controversy around it. But if we were to look at that as an example, what does it mean to think about framing a IRA-like Minnesota policy that is essentially an industrial, 22nd century industrial policy?
Yeah, that's a really good point. And in our earlier conversation with Adam Minter, like one of the points that he made was if you really want to keep, metals and e-waste inside of a system, you have to be able to locate those materials next to where the manufacturers are that want to consume them and use them, right? And so I think we're kind of talking about the industrial policy that the Inflation Reduction Act is creating, where we're onshoring a bunch of manufacturing that requires the consumption of metals in order to make it, right? That's going to be the kind of next stage, is how do we make sure we're matching these systems up together, right? Where we are locating metals and other kinds of material recovery right next to where we need to use it to manufacture the next set of products. And then also how we reduce waste, right? How do we make sure that we're using less of that, and we're directing that recovered material appropriately to those new industrial facilities. I'm going to go to a couple of questions. We've got some great questions in the chat, and I want to make sure we cover a few of them. I wanted to start with just a simple question to Maria, which I think might clarify things a little bit, which is, does Repowered produce final pure materials, or do you create a raw product that goes on to someplace else? So, for example, do you separate the materials that are on a circuit board and then send them someplace else, or at what level does Repowered work in that circular economy?
Yeah, the whole process of how e-waste is recycled is a whole webinar in itself, but we are a good example, or a typical example, of what we call a collector. So we collect your e-waste, we sort it, we break it down, dismantle it by hand, and then we're sorting it into categories like circuit boards, actually 10 different categories of circuit boards, fans, heat sinks, etc. And from there, we're sending it to the second step, which is a shredding facility. And then that facility will shred all of those components separately. And then from there, the material will go through eddy currents and magnets and sometimes optical sorters. And then the pure material will be sent to a smelter, or a material recoveries facility, which as of 2022, we're still mostly using smelting for that process, or pyrometallurgy, if you want to be technical. But so then once it goes through that process, it's a pure metal, and it can be sold to manufacturers. Unfortunately, in the US, we don't have really any large-scale e-scrap smelters. So all of our e-waste is going to places like Japan, Korea, and Germany, which is a whole nother issue on its own, that if our manufacturers want to make their stuff with recycled metals from e-waste, they have to buy it back on the international market. So if we want these metals to stay locally, we need to invest in recycling infrastructure.
Well, and a lot of folks are really interested in the statistics that you were talking about, Maria, in terms of the amount of e-waste in Minnesota and what that could do. And so a couple of questions. Danny wants to know when that report will be available. And also just Carla wants to encourage you to make that circulate that information and publicize it very widely, because it seems really important. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about what you're working on and when you expect it to be available publicly.
Soon, very soon. Yeah, we're working right now with a few different partners. Roopali was kind enough to help us write this paper, and we're working with the MCEA team to just kind of polish it and ask all the tough questions and put it under the microscope before we're ready to publish it and put it out there. But once we do, I promise we'll really do our best to put it everywhere. I know there's lots of interest. I mean, the interest originated in the Iron Range, so we're especially excited to see it circulate there. Yeah.
Great question from Paul in the chat. Is Minnesota's e-waste law making manufacturers pay for recycling of all e-waste collected in Minnesota, or are we leaving consumers on the hook for some of that cost? And asks if we're adequately incentivizing reuse in our e-waste law. I don't know if Representative Hollins or Dr. Phadke have thoughts about
that. Actually, Maria probably knows better than all of us, but
right.
I think it is really interesting how much consumers are on the hook for this, right? We have to pay a surcharge when we want to drop certain kinds of devices off. There isn't a way to sort of recoup the investment sometimes in the things that we want to then try to recycle. And what I'm really fascinated by is how the private sector is stepping in. I don't know if anyone else here are residents in St. Paul. I've seen this new company really make interesting headway into our communities. I need to do a little bit more research about it, but some of you might have seen these little white boxes sitting on people's stoops called Ridwell. And it is a company where it's a subscription service where you pay monthly and somebody comes by and picks up those hard to recycle items. I am fascinated by this. I'm fascinated by how many people have these good intentions of wanting to recycle well, right? And that they're willing to pay a third-party service and monthly fee to come to their homes and take things that they don't want to end up in drawers of shame. And so there are all these interesting market signals all around us saying that this is a desire that we have to be better, environmental stewards. And so the private sector is definitely picking up on this. And I think there's a lot here for us to learn about how better policy could not only reduce the amount of waste, but maybe also help some of these fledgling businesses that see an opportunity to do some of this work.
Well, and that reminds me of the earlier point that you were making, Maria, about the availability of drop-off locations and the responsibility on consumers. And I'm wondering if you talk a little bit about that and what you know about. So this model of like literally picking it up at your doorstep sounds really intriguing to me. But it's not really the reality for a lot of people. They have to work pretty hard to find a place to drop off their e-waste right now.
Right. It's not as of right now, it's not a very equitable solution geographically or economically. I don't know what their subscription cost is, but I do think it's pretty high. I know I looked it up at one point, but because I was really interested by it too. But really what we need to get to closer to 100% collection rate is just free and convenient drop off across all of Minnesota. Whether you live in International Falls or Wanamingo, you should be able to drive or walk shorter than an hour to drop off your electronics. And then when you get there, you shouldn't be faced with $100 bill. If you have, you're bringing your whole pile of shame, could be quite expensive to recycle. Some counties right now have contracts with the recyclers. We have a contract with Ramsey County. So Ramsey County recyclers can come to us, Ramsey County residents can come to us and drop off their electronics for free. And that model works really well for Ramsey County residents, but not for anybody else in greater Minnesota. So yeah, those are the biggest barriers right now between us going from 23.7% collection closer to 100% collection is free and convenient drop off.
Wow, that's really helpful. Thank you. There's another question in the chat from Maya, which I really like. And she asks, as we move to decarbonize and move toward encouraging manufacturing more electric vehicles, are there or could there be regulations on metal sourcing that would encourage companies to source their materials from recycled metals as opposed to what we called virgin materials earlier?
Yeah, I really like this as well. I thought this was powerful. I was going to respond to it in the chat, but I thought that was a powerful question. I think that is something that we probably would have to do on a more federal level, just because of where the manufacturing of vehicles actually occurs. But I think it's totally possible. I know that we had a bill that was similar to this about the manufacturing of the solar panels that were manufactured in Minnesota using Minnesota minerals, right? Like, precious metals and minerals, which was actually kind of more of a pro-mining piece of legislation, but we could certainly tweak that, right? To say that it has to be metals that are, recycled or from our recycling facilities here in Minnesota. And so I do think that there's I think it's a good idea to start phasing that in. I think that we would probably get a ton of pushback just politically from the manufacturers if we asked for 100% of them to be used, but certainly a percentage of it. I think we could push for that, and that would be a great start.
Yeah, and there's so many other good questions in the chat, and we'll do our best to try to address these probably after the session. But we'll probably have to end it right here. But just want to thank all of you guys. This has been an incredible conversation. super interesting stuff. And, you know, as you kind of learn when we're talking through these issues, we're all kind of figuring it out. I mean, like there's a lot of work happening, but also a lot of new ideas and a lot of new energy in this conversation. And it's largely due to the people that are on this call. So I want to just thank Maria and Representative Hollins and Dr. Phadke so much for being here today. You've done a great job, and we've really developed some new ideas, I think, just on the fly today. So thank you so much for your conversation today.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Having us.
Oh yeah, no, we love it. We love it, and we're going to continue this conversation. And one more webinar in the Mining the Climate Crisis series. It will be on January 24th from noon to 1 p.m. It's going to be kind of zooming out a little bit to a broader question about how we move toward climate action beyond extraction as the basis for it. And as I said before, we'll have Winona LeDuc from Water the Earth with us, Duluth for Clean Water's Libby Bent, and we have a couple more panelists we're hoping to add to that. So if you haven't already registered, please go to mncenter.org and register for that. All the information that you heard today, including this video, a lot of web posts and other kinds of fact sheets, other materials for you to research and to really dig into as you look into this question of metal recycling and alternatives to mining proposals, are in Minnesota Center for Environmental Advocacy's Mining the Climate Crisis series. It's on our website. You can check it out in the chat. The link's right there, or just go to mncenter.org and you can find that information there as well. And I just want to add one more time again that we can't do this work without you. We're really thankful for the support of our members and supporters across the state and elsewhere. And we want to just let you know that through the end of the calendar year, your support of MCA can be doubled through a generous matching grant with the Manitou Fund. So if you are so inclined to further support our work, please go to mncenter.org/donate and add a little bit of additional fuel to this work. Again, this has been Minnesota Center for Environmental Advocacy's Mining the Climate Crisis series webinar. And we want to thank our panelists again today. And we look forward to seeing you in January as we continue this conversation. So thanks so much again, and have a great day. Thanks, everybody.